The sun was barely creeping over the horizon, casting a faint gray light across the village of Eldon, when Tom woke to the crow of the rooster perched atop the fence outside his cottage. The air inside was damp and cool, the straw mattress beneath him lumpy but familiar. He rubbed his eyes, his fingers rough from years of labor, and swung his legs over the side of the bed. His wife Marta was already stirring, her breath soft as she rolled out of bed to prod the embers in the hearth. The fire had gone out overnight, as it often did, and the room smelled faintly of wood smoke and the sour tang of yesterday's stew. Tom pulled on his tunic, patched at the elbows, and his woolen hose, which were starting to fray at the knees. His boots, caked with dried mud, waited by the door. He didn't bother washing his face. Water was for drinking or boiling, not for splashing on skin that would only get dirty again. Marta was already at the hearth, coaxing a flame from the kindling, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this every morning for decades. She muttered something about the damp wood, but Tom didn't reply. There wasn't much to say. The day ahead was the same as yesterday, and the day before that. He stepped outside into the chill, the village stirring slowly around him. Eldon was a cluster of thatched cottages, their walls made of wattle and daub, stained dark by years of rain and smoke. The church, with its squat stone tower, loomed at the center of the village, and beyond it stretched the fields, patchwork strips of barley, rye, and oats. Tom's plot was out there, one of many owned by the lord of the manor, who took half of everything they grew. It was a fact of life, like the rain or the ache in Tom's back. His first task was to feed the animals. The family's 2 pigs snorted as he approached their pen, their snouts rooting in the mud for scraps. He tossed them a handful of vegetable peelings from Marta's cooking, saved in a bucket by the door. The chickens clucked and strutted in their coop, and he scattered a fistful of grain for them, watching as they pecked at the dirt. The cow, a bony creature with a dull brown coat, lowed softly as he checked her tether. She'd need milking soon, but Marta would handle that after breakfast. Back inside, Marta had a fire going, and the smell of barley porridge filled the cottage. Their son, Will, 9 years old and already lanky, was sitting on the floor, whittling a stick with a small knife. Tom grunted at him to put it away and help set the table, which was really just a rough plank balanced on 2 stumps. Will obeyed, dragging his feet, and soon they were eating, the porridge bland but warm, thickened with a bit of milk from the cow. Marta added a pinch of salt, a luxury they used sparingly, and Tom chewed slowly, his teeth grinding against the occasional bit of grit in the meal. After breakfast, Tom grabbed his hoe and sickle and headed to the fields. The walk was short, past the blacksmith's forge, where the clang of hammer on iron was already starting, and the mill, its wheel creaking as the river pushed it along. The other villagers were out too, old Agnes carrying a basket of turnips, John the co-opper rolling a barrel toward the alehouse, and a gaggle of children chasing a stray goose. Tom nodded to them but kept moving. The fields waited for no one. His plot was a narrow strip marked by a line of stones, and it was heavy with weeds. The barley was coming in, but not as well as he'd hoped. The spring had been too wet, the summer too dry. He set to work with the hoe, breaking up the soil around the stalks, pulling up nettles and dockweed that seemed to thrive no matter the weather. The sun climbed higher, and sweat beaded on his brow now the weather. The sun climbed higher, and sweat beaded on his brow, soaking it into the rough wool of his tunic. His hands, calloused and scarred, moved with a rhythm born of years of repetition. Bend, dig, pull, toss. Bend, dig, pull, toss. The work was mindless, but it filled the hours. By noon, his back was screaming, and he paused to drink from the water skin he'd brought. The water was tepid, tasting faintly of the leather, but it eased the dryness in his throat. He sat on a stone at the edge of his plot, watching the other villagers at work. Some were harvesting early rye. Their sickles flashing in the sunlight. Others were tending to their own strips, their movements as slow and steady as his own. No one spoke much. There was little to say that hadn't been said before. Marta appeared around midday carrying a cloth bundle with their lunch, a hunk of coarse bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and an onion. They ate in silence, sitting in the shade of an oak tree that marked the boundary between Tom's plot and the next. The cheese was sharp, the bread stale but filling. The onion made Tom's eyes water, but he chewed it anyway, knowing it might be the only thing with flavor he'd eat today. Marta mentioned that the cow's milk was thin, and they'd need to barter for more hay soon. Tom nodded, already calculating what they could spare to trade. After lunch, he returned to the fields, this time with his sickle to cut back some of the barley that was ready. The stalks were tough, and the blade needed sharpening, but he made do. The work was slower now, the heat of the afternoon pressing down on him. Flies buzzed around his face, and he swatted them away, cursing under his breath. By late afternoon, his basket was half full of barley stalks, enough to take to the manor's barn for threshing later in the week. The Lord's steward would count every bundle, making sure Tom paid his due. As the sun began to dip, Tom trudged back to the village, his basket slung over his shoulder. The air was cooler now, and the village was alive with the sounds of evening. The lowing of cows being herded back from pasture, the laughter of children playing near the well, the rhythmic thud of the baker kneading dough for tomorrow's bread. Marta was outside the cottage, milking the cow, her hands steady as she filled a wooden bucket. Will was chopping firewood, his small axe biting into the logs with uneven swings. Dinner was more porridge, this time with a bit of boiled cabbage and a scrap of bacon fat Marta had saved. They ate by the light of a single tallow candle, its flame flickering in the drafty cottage. Will chattered about a frog he'd caught by the river, but Tom barely listened, his mind the work still to be done. The fence needed mending, the cow shed was leaking, and there was always more weeding to do. Marta mentioned the church tithe, due at the end of the month, and Tom felt a familiar knot in his stomach. They'd managed, they always did, but it was never easy. After dinner, Tom sat by the hearth, sharpening his sickle with a whetstone. The scrape of stone on metal was soothing, a small task he could control. Marta mended a tear in Will's tunic, her needle moving in the dim light. Will was already half asleep, curled up on a pile of straw near the fire. The cottage was quiet, save for the crackle of the flames and the distant bark of a dog. When the candle burned low, Tom banked the fire, covering the embers with ash to keep them alive until morning. He and Marta climbed into bed, the straw creaking beneath them. The night was cold, and they pulled the thin wool blanket tight. Tom's body ached, his hands stiff from the day's work, but sleep came quickly. Tomorrow would be the same. Up at dawn. Feed the animals, work the fields, eat, sleep, repeat. It was a life of routine, small tasks that filled the hours of a world that began and ended at the edge of the village. And for Tom, that was enough.